SOEs effective. Here, well, the World Bank has developed a generic framework. This is my framework one. A generic framework that demonstrates who the key players are and how they interact and function. This particular framework you can adapt and use as you please, but it is really ultimately primarily designed for a private sector governance model. All right, I'm putting it up because I have stated that in order for governance to function in any country, you need a multiplicity of players who must all function effectively. Internally, we will deal with the state. We will break down the state where under the column internal players, which is the shareholder being the state, the board of directors, all right, management, and the core functions. Generally, these roles are normally found at common law or company law or any particular legislation that says that if you're a shareholder, your rights are to vote the board in, your rights are to determine the business in the case of SOE. So you need a whole regulatory framework that determines how those roles obviously interact and who does what. That is the one angle. The other angle is around what we call reputational agents. Because in some instances, you know, behavior, corporate behavior, is influenced by who the general stakeholders are, whether it's citizens or civil society in this case, or whether it's accountants and lawyers. They influence the thinking, all right? And the strength of all of those agents and their ability to speak and speak freely and to criticize, which is a function of the strength of a democracy if it's in a democracy, or the strength of citizen rights if it's not a democracy. Those players also influence accountability and how these corporations behave. There is obviously the other angle where the state in itself as regulator needs to tread carefully because its role is to strengthen those institutions. You do need a strong, reliable, and consistent regulatory framework in order for accountability to take root, all right? And that framework sets the standards of behavior. It sets the laws and regulation. And there's the debt and equity market that also materially influences behavior. How they are going to invest if you are conducting a private partnership, will they get the necessary return? Are they efficient in terms of delivering value? In this instance, financial value and the like. And the general markets, all of those players working together play a different role in strengthening and influencing the effectiveness of the governance process. So there is no doubt that this is a function of maturity of various sectors in any society, even before we look at the institution itself. It does not mean that nothing can be done. This particular model re-emphasizes the point that I've made earlier around that framework, that there are various circles of accountability that must work together to help drive effective governance. You know, civil society groups, government and regulators, information providers, you know, information standards need to be clear. Boards of companies need to understand what their role are. Corporate executives and the workforce need to deliver. And investors and the like, whether those investors are in fact purely citizens who are recipients of services and so on. So that whole circle of accountability needs to work. So at a macro level, a hell of a lot of work is generally required to galvanize that process. I assume that you know, please forgive me if I'm speaking out of 10 about your society. It would be purely out of my own ignorance, but one of the things that I observe is that because Tanzania develops from a socialist model and into a market or hybrid type of model, that there are incredible opportunities to start driving the conversation around accountability and governance. And that is driven by economic growth and some of your resources, which you are blessed with. So what it means is that you're gonna think hard and act quickly in terms of how you grow your institutions to respond to that, whilst reserving what needs to be reserved for the general populace of this particular country. Because one of the risks in a boom like you see, and a resource-based boom, which to me seems like another gold rush, which is incredible, is that you will get, you know, players coming in, taking advantage of the weak policy and or weak regulatory framework, and taking returns and behaving in ways that in their own countries they are not allowed to behave. So clarity is required immediately at that level in order to help drive this growth and setting the necessary frameworks. Now, back to the shareholder as owner. The basis of share ownership, especially between the board, the management, and the various players, comes from what is called the agency theory, in that the share owners don't run the business unless you are talking a different type of enterprise, which is generally family-owned and so on. This model is based on a rather mature capital market scenario, that the share owner entrusts the business to the board, and the board develops the strategy, but alignment is required between the share owner and the board around what the strategy is. Otherwise, you take your money and invest elsewhere. And the board allows the management to implement. So basically, in terms of roles, the shareholder decides the business, all right? And the directors decide the strategy, and the management implements that strategy. That's the one quadrant on the left hand, on the right hand side. But because managers have access to information, key performance indicators and the like, and what is happening in the operations, accountability moves upwards in the sense that there needs to be processes of disclosure and processes of accountability to enable the shareholder to be informed, not just at the end of results or when there is a crisis, but how the company is performing. So basically, in terms of this model, the shareholder is not charged with getting their hands dirty in the operations. The shareholder puts their capital, sets the lines of accountability, seeks the return that they want, and gets it through efficient, transparent reports. That is the classical model. Now, in the context of this model, how do we take this and start to translate it into dealing with some of the unique dilemmas faced by SOEs? Because if you look at it, depending on the structure of government, here by executive I mean the cabinet, which is ultimately accountable to Parliament, you know, acting either through the institutional ministry, which is in charge of all SOEs in most countries, in concert with the functional ministry, which is in charge of policy. They determine the political and social mandate. What is this enterprise in this particular area? What do we need to achieve? What is our mandate as the government? What do our citizens expect? All right. And where there's something called lost in translation, I'm calling this a translation model. So from the top down, from the top up, there is a whole translation process that needs to occur, and occur efficiently, all right? In that, here it's called the secretary, and I assume I'm right, in my country it's called the director general, then translates that political mandate, all right, into enterprise objectives. What is the purpose of this enterprise in the context of the policy, government policy that we have? What is its purpose, all right? And that mandate is in turn translated into the board, who must then develop a strategy to achieve that. So you need a whole lot of efficiencies in that process of translation right through down. And the board translates that into implementation by management in terms of what it is that they must deliver. So clarity on that whole process from top right down is a necessary prerequisite. I'm not going to go over that, all right? But in that model, we need transparent communication. We need less surprises in the system. And we need to achieve alignment in terms of objectives so that we know what the deliverables are and what the outcomes that we seek are. So we need a whole process of feedback. And that on its own would help know who is accountable for what. And it removes the diffusion and not knowing that if the SOE is not delivering, who is responsible. It allows the board to take ultimate responsibility. So in having said that, if you accept that as a framework within which to look at things, once there's all of that clarity, then how does the share government as a share owner exercise its levers of influence? How does it act and how does it behave? The model is simply that the government exercises its levers of influence as shareholder through board appointments. And it agrees the strategic plan with the SOE through the minister that is accountable. And it helps appoint an effective chairman. And from our own experience, this whole process is bedeviled by sometimes political interest, all right? And those tend to sometimes supersede the need for experience and efficiency. And there is no question that, in my view, there are instances where also from the point of board composition and even managing succession in SOEs, they can sometimes fall foul with who is in government and who is not in government. And that on its own, that uncertainty on its own begins to influence how efficient they become. So managing both board composition and managing board appointments is in its own a task. The role of the chairman is absolutely essential. In my view, a combination of experience and the ability to understand and engage with government policy and having that access is in itself a skill and is in itself a necessary contribution. So you need to start composing your boards in ways that are sufficiently diverse and sufficiently correct in order to meet the requirements or the objectives of that SOE. And that can be done not necessarily through law, but by developing transparent processes of board selection and deselection, stating what the requirements may be, and allowing perhaps here and there a hell of a lot of competitiveness. And that creates, on its own, a more professional way of selecting boards. The second level and lever of influence is that because as owner you are not going to get your hands dirty into day-to-day operations, there are tools for control that are used. South Africa uses the shareholder compact, which is an agreement between the minister exercising oversight with that SOE, and is part of that translation of objectives and purpose into strategy and deliverables. Alignment around that is required. That on its own gives you the clarity that at the end of that financial year, remuneration tends to be based on the delivery on that. And that obviously emulates what happens in the private sector. So you cannot help but now start changing the behavior in the board once you have those shareholder compacts in terms of what needs to be delivered by that SOE. I think the UK uses what they call the shareholder executive, extremely useful piece in the sense that it is principles-based, but however the agreements are much more finer. So there are a number of models where the state can use as tools for control to start to drive the performance of the SOE. We've spoken about the engaged versus an interfering shareholder. That, you need clarity around that, because when the shareholder runs the business every day, it diffuses accountability, unfortunately, and you can't fire the board, and no one takes responsibility for anything. And I believe that this helps clarify who is responsible for it. The shareholder must monitor that performance, and if it's not delivered, must fire the board and get directors who can assist in delivering that. And that on its own sometimes tends to be muddled and influenced by, politics of the day. So competency at the top is completely uncompromisable if you are going to deliver efficient governance. Well, I think Ambassador Antika has already alluded that we see a hell of a lot of conversation around your remuneration. I mean, in South Africa as well, the minister, has stepped in and created a remuneration model and framework for SOE executives, because sometimes they're hard to come by and there's a huge competitive market in terms of skill. And remuneration versus performance needs a good conversation and an obvious framework. And that is another lever of influence by the government. There is obviously sometimes things do go wrong. Therefore, either through the board secretary or the DG in this case, the CEO and the DG tend to converse more frequently than it would be the DG and the chairman of the board. But you need, obviously, a transparent way of communicating and reporting, and this is purely outside of that annual financial statement and reports. So that, and this is not new, even in the private sector. There is generally conversation between investors and the company to see how it's performing. So, when people say the state interferes, they also need to understand that, communication and reporting needs to be open in terms of knowing what is happening in terms of reporting, and to pick up problems early if there needs to be financial injection or there's particular, because there ought to be no surprises between the two, the shareholder and the board. There ought to be no surprises. Just as an additional caution, state also helps, this particular model helps the state appreciate its role as owner and take into account that also it plays the role as regulator. So, in a regulatory framework that is mature, people sue the state, and that on its own creates problems in the system around implementation. So those lines need to be clearly drawn, because Otherwise, the state as owner gets into an incredible conflict in terms of how it runs the business. I think that for us, those were the benefits of a constitutional democracy. Now, lastly, or penultimately, I want to talk about the board and exactly then what the role of the board is in this. The conversation around governance tends to be, I'm not sure whether it's mischievous or not. I think people talk about ticking the box and all of that. There are really two significant elements. I'm using that diagram to just help you along. Is that the board is the business brain, and there are two elements that it needs to balance. The one is that it is charged with the driving of that enterprise forward, being that strategic thinking and performance. And then the other dilemma it needs to manage is to keep the enterprise under prudent control, which is the accountability quadrant. So those are the two dilemmas, and what tends to happen is that because in an underdeveloped scenario, focus tends to be on this compliance, ticking the box and all of that. The driving aspect of board performance is easily forgotten and therefore leads to non-delivery and the inability for that enterprise to work. So the board needs to be taught, this is an art, this is a discipline, and it's a matter of experience on how to stick to its role, which is to look at the strategy, hold management to account, read what is going on in the environment and so on. And this is a learned art. This is a learned skill. This is a learned discipline. So back to the board. The quality of strategic board on the board is absolutely critical. Apart from that, we've talked about board leadership and the role of the chairman, in that when you have a diverse board with the necessary skills that are required for that enterprise, the chairman needs to know how to regulate and extract from the experience around the table things of value to help drive the enterprise. And I have spoken already around management of succession, because one of the issues that we picked up in our own country is that whenever there's an election, there's then an uncertainty who is staying and who is going and what the new minister may want and so on. Professionalizing and managing that succession is absolutely critical, because sometimes you'll find an SOE sitting without a CEO because the minister needs to sanction and understand that this person is acceptable and so on and so on. I don't have answers on how you deal with that. I honestly do not, but I believe that where the system is relatively mature, and it's not unusual for a CEO to resign because somebody else has come in, even in the private sector, or new share owners have come in. It's not something that we need to be ashamed or shy away from, but in order to cushion the ability to deliver, either we align, which is impossible to do, board appointments with political elections or not, I don't know that would work. Or either we accept that once a board is appointed with a term, we can grow up and be professional enough to allow it to deliver. And when its term ends, if you want to retain some of the skills, please do. But if you need to bring in additional skill, by all means, your rights as a shareholder are there to do that, as long as they are probably meeting the requirements of the enterprise. Then there's the right culture. And I've alluded to that with us, the whole constitutional dispensation began to start to imbue particular values which were necessary to drive that, the corporate governance discourse and trajectory. And reporting and accountability, we hear this about accounting standards and the like. There are systems to enhance that, whether legislatively or otherwise. Now, earlier on, this is my last slide, and thanks for your indulgence. We need to start thinking hard and fast about what we need to do to hold the institutions of which we are charged in trust for future. In South Africa, there's a lot of talk about corporate stewardship, about sustainability, which affects all sorts of angles, because we are really ultimately sitting there for the growth of the economy, for the growth of our country, for the growth of the business in the future. And institutions are not built on short term. So what this means is that over and above that, the human rights element, the environmental aspects, and social responsibility aspects become material in the whole decision framework and allocation of resources by. And what we're trying to drive is long-term sustainability of the business rather than short-term gains. And that's a thinking. And really, stewardship also means an inclusive, responsive leadership and imbuing the values of accountability and transparency. So the long and short of it is that, yes, you can have the laws, you will tick the box, but ultimately, really, we need to start imbuing those values. How we get into that conversation is something I leave to you. And those are my thoughts. Thank you very much.